Everybody. We're sort of ready to start the afternoon session. So I'd like to sort of ask Henry Murison, Director of Northern Powerhouse, to come up and talk to us about backing business growth right across the north, giving cities the power and resources they need to reach their huge untapped potential. Henry, would you like to come and...
Brilliant. No, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And I think from all of the discussions I've heard about today, and I'm only just unfortunately able to get here from London, the kind of the tone and tenor of the discussion you've been having is one which I'm really glad is happening. And obviously we are in one of the kind of great institutions of Northeast history and of the North's history, built on the success and the economic and entrepreneurship power, the entrepreneurial and economic power that really defined this region's formative history. And I think the reason that I was so keen to be here today is that the Northeast and the wider north of England have some huge assets to contribute to this nation, to contribute to the transition to net zero. And the same way that in the Humber and in many other parts of the north of England and around the UK, we have seen a revolution in wind energy in the last 15, 20 years that has taken what was a fringe technology and made it into a leading British success story. We need to learn the lessons of how that success was generated, but also what we could have done better. And the learning, and the reason I particularly refer to the wind sector, was that the north of England actually, and the UK, may have got the blade factory in Hull, which we're really glad and is seeing further investment from Siemens, but we did not capture most of the value chain around that particular industry. And so the UK may generate almost kind of by any measure the greatest percentage of its electricity currently and in the future from that particular source, and has outpaced many others in terms of the rollout of that technology despite having started slower, particularly in that offshore space. But actually many of the supply chains and the sort of consumed elements, so the parts that go into those wind turbines, are not made in the UK and are not necessarily designed in the UK. And why I think rare earth minerals in particular are so critical is that the UK does want to and has made a stated commitment to lead the world in battery technology, and both in the West Midlands and with more success actually here in the north of England, in the northeast in particular, where we've got two confirmed gigafactories now being developed and coming forward. There is a genuine opportunity for us to maybe be able to, post-Brexit, maintain our very successful car industry here in the UK. And it is an existential challenge, which is that now we cannot import batteries, right, from other parts of the world and put them in our UK-assembled cars and expect to be able to sell them into the single market, because the nature and the terms of our departure from the European Union, which I won't labour, insists that we have UK content in those cars, a very high proportion of UK content. And because so much of the value of a car in the future, an electric car in particular, obviously, rather than a combustion engine vehicle or a fuel cell, will be in the battery. Obviously, the fuel cell is a very similar argument. It is impossible for us to think about how we develop an electric car kind of in a sustainable industry, not just at Nissan, but across the UK, if we can't make those batteries here in the north of England and in the Midlands. And so, in the same spirit that if you're going to be good at making batteries, you also need to think about what are the component parts of those batteries and how can you have security of supply to ensure that your industries are resilient and robust. And one of the great challenges we have is that the current markets where we would get these raw materials from are not necessarily ones that are the most predictable or reliable. And there are real benefits, of course, to having a domestic processing capability, because even if we do exploit the opportunities, as I know Weardale Lithiums want to do, and others want to do as far afield down in Cornwall, and we want all those places to succeed, we at the Northern Powers Partnership want to make sure that the processing industries that can come on the back of that, as well as those like our colleagues at British Volt in Blyth, can all benefit from having a greater and more secure supply chain here in the north of England that can enable them to compete and enable our car industry in particular to continue to be the success that we want it to be. And of course, I do hope that those who are developing alternatives in the electric vehicle and motor space that don't require rare earth minerals are successful, because obviously the UK only has capability for about a quarter of its future production needs in the coming decades. And so I welcome those opportunities, but it is very likely that particularly for the current design crop of electric vehicles in particular, we are going to need significant numbers of batteries made in the UK, and those are going to have to require significant components and elements that we can get right here in the north of England. And so the context for why someone whose kind of professional life is talking about the wider economy being interested in this particular area is that in the north of England we have championed, in the time that I've been doing this job for the last 5 years, and George Osborne before that as Chancellor when he first developed this proposal, what we would consider to be significant projects and significant areas for new development that are game-changing. So for those of you who are not familiar with the north of England's economy, I won't labour the point too much or for too long, but it ain't as productive as that of the South East or Greater London in particular, and in particular the square mile. And as someone who lives and works in Yorkshire but spent a number of years here in the North East, including working in local government on the political side of things, I have been at the coalface, which is a particularly apt phrase in this particular building, of some of these debates for a lot longer than I've been in this job. And the kind of real opportunity for the north of England is, rather than seeking incremental change, we can seek to make those step changes that are ambitious. And I do sometimes sense with this particular government a predilection towards the incremental, despite the narrative and the language and the speeches being about the transformational. And the reason why that is a problem is that you are not going to close decades and decades of underperformance of the north, and with it much lower levels of wider UK productivity, because it's the rest of the country outside London that is holding back the UK's comparative position with other parts of the world, if you only do incremental things. And we believe the fact that despite having spent lots of time and energy in the West Midlands on this, that actually the gigafactory developments have largely come to the north of England, is a reflection of the wider positive economic environment we've created in the north of England, with very, particularly here in the northeast, very strong connections between the further education and wider skills sector, our universities around higher skills, the local public sector, local authorities, but also the local enterprise partnership, the mayoral authority here in the north of Tyne, which we now expect to extend and include very shortly, we hope, the south bank of the Tyne as well as Wearside. And so we do believe there is a huge opportunity here in the north of England to close that productivity gap. We believe this sector and the debates you've been having today at this conference are directly relevant because they have the scale and the importance to make that contribution. And we were very strong advocates for what is now Anglo American's project. Wood Smith Mine started off and developed by Sirius Minerals, a very challenging project with lots more impact, right, on the local environment, in that case in the national park. And just over lunch I was discussing with some people who are involved in this project the relative difference, right? So this is a much easier thing to land, some of the projects we're talking about here today and some of the opportunities we're talking about here today, than developments that have been very difficult to get local community buy-in for. And we as an organisation will be making sure we make the case in local communities for both the local economic benefits but also the case of what it means for the wider region here in the North East. And I do believe that many in communities, particularly in County Durham, will be very supportive of the fact that the lithium being produced and processed and then used here in the North East isn't just going to benefit their own local community and create good quality local jobs for people who come from those areas, but is also going to be helping the North East to continue to succeed in the thing that actually helped reimagine what this part of the country is about. And the association of the North East, as my colleagues at the North East Chamber often rightly make the point, with export and trade, is that this is the part of the country that doesn't have a trade deficit, right? So we talk a lot about the UK's relative economic problems and our trade deficit with the rest of the world. The North East of England does not have a trade deficit. And the project that started that huge reversal in the North East fortune, despite the deindustrialisation that saw the loss of Swan Hunter, the loss of many other great North East and in that case, Tyneside institutions, it was the investment of a Japanese company called Nissan down the A19 and across the Tyne Bridge from where we're standing now in Sunderland. And the fact that we can help to improve the competitive advantage of some significant regionally based businesses that are global in scale and help to ensure that the supply chain that rely on them, right, because all the way from Port Talbot The steel comes and is offloaded at the Port of Middlesbrough onto AV Dawson trucks to be driven up the A19. Those drivers and those working in that warehouse in Middlesbrough are just a fraction of the many tens of thousands of people whose livelihoods and whose families' livelihoods depend on the car manufacturing sector in this region. And absolutely, we need to tell the story about how these emerging markets and these disruptions to current global supply chains of products that are currently in scarce supply and often with an uncertain amount of control over where they're going to go in the world, that we can both improve and support those industries that have themselves redefined this region and given it back its sense of pride, something I'm very glad has happened, and also create genuine local economic value in communities which we know have not necessarily shared in those benefits. So as much as Newcastle and because of what's happened in Washington, Sunderland, have seen a renaissance despite the loss of some of their traditional industries, the loss of the Port of Sunderland, the loss, as I alluded to, of shipbuilding on the Tyne, some very other significant changes. The huge scaling down of the Armstrong Works in Newcastle, which was generated the wealth that built the many parts of the city that I happen to represent when I lived here, the Armstrong Parks, Jesmond Dean. These were public institutions gifted to the city because of its industrial strength and heritage and preeminence at the time globally, not just in the UK. And it is absolutely the case that Newcastle has seen a resurgence as a city in the last 20 years since my wife first came to study here and I started spending a lot of time here and then moved here. But the economic change that I've seen in Newcastle has not been replicated in many of the towns and communities in County Durham. And I think that an abstract debate about levelling up that divides and sets towns and cities against each other is very unhelpful. But actually, it is not correct to only attract and want to develop high-value, knowledge-intensive jobs in cities, because the economic learnings of the North of England, the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review, which we are very much champions of and was commissioned and informed much of what the Northern Powerhouse agenda has sought to pursue, is very clear that it is those industries, like manufacturing, which depends on rare earth minerals, for example, for its future, that generate the value in the north that is then able to create the types of jobs that we see in cities. So without people in industries such as the ones that are represented here today, and the people that you supply or will supply in the future, there is not the money in the northeast economy to build the nice shiny buildings and to keep them filled with people that cities like Newcastle absolutely depend. And so for the northeast to have its heyday continue, we cannot rely on the stag and hen parties of the UK to keep Newcastle's economy turning. We need successful businesses across the region in the northeast, creating genuine economic value and creating supply chains that not only give you exportable end products that can be world-leading and world-beating, and we see just last week that the electric version of the Qashqai is starting to come off the production line in Sunderland. The fact that a quarter of Europe's electric cars in the last decade, have been made here in the northeast is something of immense pride to me, and it is absolutely something to build from as we talk about what the discussions you've been having today will help us to build in the wider region, because the direct benefits of what is being discussed today and developing what can be achieved here and in Cornwall, we want to see all places that have got opportunities in this succeed. We can all succeed in this space, I think. So this isn't about rivalry, this is about competition. And it's about producing those follow-on industries that will generate the most added value from doing this, not just the direct benefits from doing so. And that is how I think we can convince people in the communities that will need to accept this, that it is worth having. It certainly has convinced many of their political leaders, I know already, from the very successful discussions on this that were held at the Northern Research Group conference, where this was one of the key themes that came out of many of the discussions and the breakout that focused on it. And I'm absolutely really looking forward to a bit of Q&A around what the economic value of the debates you're having here could be if we capitalise on them, and how we can seek to make sure that the North East continues to be able to lead the world in many ways, as it has always done before. And rather than restating and reflecting on the splendour and beauty that has been produced by those who've succeeded before us, we can start to achieve those sorts of things in our own right again. So it's an absolute pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for finding time on the agenda to invite me to speak. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Henry. That was
all right?
We've got a Q&A session now. I think your passion and energy for what you do comes across. And so I'll open up the floor. Can I ask anybody who wants a question, can you use the microphone? Because you can't be heard otherwise on the AV equipment for people going out and having a coffee or something. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And can you please use the microphone, Peter?
Hi. Hello, is this working? Yeah, good. Good. Hi, Peter Robinson, mining engineer, and we're sitting in the Mining Institute. And I agree with everything you've said, but when you get to the components, and we talk about the gigabyte, the one word you didn't mention was the raw material. And the raw materials to make batteries are mined. Now, we can mine them here in the Northwest, and we're sitting in a very traditional heritage of mining in the Northeast, or we can import the raw materials. But resurrecting mining is high risk, and it will be difficult because there'll be a lot of enthusiasm, but there'll be high risk. And it's the type of high risk to get these projects going that requires grant funding, just as English partnerships have done in air. And the type of grant funding we've used over the years in the early days in brownfield land regeneration was grant funding and loan funding. So it was a grant if it didn't work. If it did work, it was paid back. But is the government going to make available grant funding for the high-risk ventures, which are primary industry raw materials, that will then make them easier to fund and get going a lot quicker?
I think it's a fair point, and I think, and clearly we've worked, and I kind of in another raw material context, and I mentioned Sirius as a comparable example, because I think it is a comparable example, and that also was a project that was very high risk, right? I mean, the people who originally started it, what was York Potash that became Sirius, went bust, right, and had to be bought out by Anglo-American. So I've been through some quite difficult challenges, and in that example, the tool that government did have available to it that would have allowed Sirius to do that project rather than requiring a larger parent company who could raise money in different ways was through Treasury guarantees. The UK's new National Infrastructure Bank based in Leeds also have tools around loan funding available, and loan funding that would not be available otherwise commercially, right? So they're prepared to lend on projects that are not necessarily traditionally investable. So I think that the UK funding climate is not the most auspicious, right? So Treasury are not full of, we want to give people money, right, to deliver particular projects. But I think that every sector that wants state intervention, and this one has a strong case, right? So we have intervened, like there is money, there is state money in British vaults. I mean, it has got 16 times loading factor, so for every pound the government has put in, I think they've attracted around £16 of private investments. That's a pretty good return on investment for government. So I don't think government is averse to investing in high-risk projects and helping to de-risk them, but I think we also do need to look at those public institutions that have been created specifically to enable entrepreneurs and businesses that want to take on high-risk projects to do so. And I think my experience in this space, and I'm always happy to help individuals, and I'm sure some of the businesses and others who've made today happen will have those conversations with us in more detail. But my kind of start of a 10 would be, if you want to get Kwasi Kwarteng or whoever to write you a cheque, or Treasury to write you a cheque, because in the end it's always their money, that's at least how they perceive it. It's really our money, but that's not how they think about it. You have to have exhausted those other forms of support that government do make available and demonstrate that they are not on their own enough, if that makes sense. So you have to get that gap to be the smallest it possibly can be, and the way you do that is by taking every other tool available that government can make available to you. But I know the team who developed English Partnerships very well, and I understand their model, and I absolutely agree with you that the state should be more entrepreneurial about helping support projects of national importance or projects of very significant regional impact, and this would tick both those boxes.
But I think that's important. I'm speaking from strength because I secured back in the 1990s one of the first English partnership grants to regenerate a power station site in Merseyside, £10 million at the beginning, English partnerships, and we paid it back. But nobody would have funded that because of the risk. but the model we created worked. Here, you've got a stark choice. Everything you've said about the downstream, gigabyte batteries, etc., is absolutely great, 100% supportive, but the weak link is the raw material. And if the companies that have invested don't get the raw material locally, they will import.
Yeah.
And no question they'll import. I know where they'll come from. And there is a golden opportunity to produce those raw materials locally, which I think is really important. And we're sitting in an institution that is a heritage to the Northeast mining sector, which is great. But those are projects that will be hard to fund without some support. But it's not high risk. I believe it's a necessity to produce locally produced raw materials, because if all of this investment is fundamentally dependent on imported raw materials, I think you've missed the opportunity.
No, I don't, and I probably didn't say it explicitly enough at the beginning, but you probably should have. What I was essentially telling you is there is an economic case for why you should do this beyond the immediate benefit. That makes sense to the people who are doing it. And that's the key existential point, and that's why government would be interested. I think that the Northeast has, in more recent times, right, and I know some of the facilities personally, and I've gone around them, a lot of them were in Newcastle or had impacts on Newcastle. There have been other forms of extractive industries going on permanently, right, just because we got out of the coal mining business, not by the Northeast's own choosing. The Northeast has not got out of the extractive industries business, but though all those things, some of the facilities that banks run, the project I alluded to that has an impact obviously on Whitby, but carries through to the Teesport and to the Semcor site where they actually process the material. The economic reality is that the Northeast has never stopped doing things like this. The point is that this is a new and emerging area of more economic significance than the things that we have been doing for the last 20 years, and that is the key point.
To reiterate it, you're sitting in a room that is destined to this, has got a huge mining heritage.
Well, and I'm agreeing with you.
And I'm wanting to re-establish the heritage mining, not for coal, but for raw materials, for everything we're trying to achieve. And I think it was really important that we produce the mined raw materials here in the Northeast. And I think the government should recognise and support that aim and that